Hey noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and today we're talking about Joan of Arc. Absolutely fascinating historical character, but today's video is going to be a little different. We're not just going to talk about the events that have to do with her history, that of course, while diving into the historical context, but we will talk specifically about one thing: her influence. The context in which Joan of Arc's story takes place is the 100 Years' War, the conflict between the Kingdom of England and the Kingdom of France that lasted, with some interruptions, from 1337 to 1453. Now, a deep analysis would consider the reasons as to why such a long-lasting war would break out to be rather complex, and in fact, at a certain level, multifaceted. But for this video, I'm going to give you the initial, superficial, but still all-encompassing answer. The English royal family of the Plantagenet claimed the throne of France, claiming the validity of such a succession to their ties with the French dynasty of the Valois. Although it is simplistically portrayed as a war between England and France, in reality the context of the 100 Years' War is much more complex and politically intricate. Its fourth phase, which began in 1423, sees on one side Charles VII of Valois, who controlled much of south-central France and who enjoyed the military support of the Kingdom of Scotland, and on the other side Henry VI of England, who controlled several portions of northern France and present-day Belgium, Brittany and Gascony, and who also enjoyed the support of the Burgundians, who controlled not only Burgundy but also the Flanders and Brabant. So in other words, if we were to really define this overall historical picture when Joan of Arc emerged, it would be more similar to a civil war, a French civil war if you will, between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, of which the English crown seeks to take advantage to support its own rights to the French throne, and which consequently leads to an intervention by Scotland alongside the Armagnac in an anti-English function. To that, add the fact that in its middle phases, the 100 Years' War had also involved the Spanish Kingdom of Navarre, Aragon and Castile, the Republic of Genoa, and the Kingdom of Bohemia. So rather than a war between England and France, it should probably be better considered to be a large-scale European war of the late Middle Ages. Joan of Arc was born on the 6th of January 1412 in the small village of Domremy in eastern France, and was born into a peasant family. At age 13, as she would testify during her trial, she began to have mystical visions of the Archangel Michael, Saint Catherine and Saint Margaret, who would urge her to fight against the English invaders. Joan took a vow of chastity for which she was nicknamed La Pucelle, meaning the young virgin, and at age 16 she presented herself to Robert de Baudricourt, commander of the French garrison in the small village of Vaucouleurs, managing to convince him to escort her to the presence of Charles VII. Now, whenever we think of Joan of Arc, also due to not only the movies and representations, but also the iconographic imagery of the period, we always see her either wielding a sword, sometimes wearing plate armor, and therefore one might think that what characterizes Joan of Arc is her warrior nature. But then again, we don't really know if she knew how to use a sword that well. We do know that she participated in a few battles, and I will, of course, tell you all about that. But I think the one skill that Joan of Arc had that really was exceptional, and that she already had at this time, the very time when she presented herself to the king in the presence of Charles VII, it's her extraordinary charisma. Her uncommon charisma appears even at this juncture in her life, and although the Baudricourt initially refuses to accommodate her, Joan managed to involve the town's population with her passionate speeches, convincing them of her sacred mandate and her need to go to the court of the Dauphin of France, thus exerting indirect pressure on the nobleman, who found himself capitulating. The girl managed to impress Charles VII, and not without first being subjected to multiple examinations by French ecclesiastical authorities, who ascertained her good faith. Joan was then sent by the Dauphin of France to support the French troops engaged in holding the city of Orléans, besieged by the English. Orléans held both a symbolic and strategic role, and its fall into English hands would have immediately decided the course of the war. Now check this out. Upon her arrival, she immediately confronted the commanding officer, Jean de Dunois, who was in charge of the city's defenses. And in the following days, she actually managed to convince and push the French forces into a series of successful sorties against the English surrounding strongholds, which, I would like to underline, she led personally. And eventually she will manage to break the siege and cause the ultimate retreat of the enemy. Imagine that. As the intensity of the conflict waned, both due to England's economic inability to sustain it and France's need to consolidate its domains, Joan started becoming an increasingly marginal figure until she found herself carrying forward what was in fact taking on the shape of a personal enterprise with the support of an army of volunteers. Captured in battle by the Burgundians, Joan was ransomed not by Charles VII but by the English crown, which arranged for her trial, carried out by ecclesiastical authorities on charges of heresy. In 1431, at age 19, Joan was charged guilty and she will die burnt at the stake. If you're enjoying this video so far, please take a moment to check out my Patreon page. With as little as a $5 support, you can help us ensure that we can continue to produce high quality and high researched content. And at the same time, you get access to polls, extra videos, unlisted streams, and much more. Thank you so much. Faced with the entire epic of Joan of Arc, a peasant's daughter who finds herself, by God's mandate, leading the French army into battle, a spontaneous question arises. How much of Joan's figure is a posthumous construction, an artificial national myth, and how much of her figure, charisma, and deeds were actually decisive in the course of the war? In reality, the sources that help us delineate the role actually played by Joan of Arc during the 100 Years' War are related to the so-called rehabilitation trial, which took place between 1450 and 1456, just about 20 years after her death. Rather than the creation of a national myth, it seems we are witnessing a real desire to clear Joan's name from the accusations of the previous heresy trial by those figures such as Jean de Dunois and Charles VII himself, who out of incapacity of perhaps even calculation had not ransomed her when she had fallen into the hands of the Burgundians. What emerges from the documents relating to the rehabilitation trial is, in any case, that Joan's role, at least until the capture of Reims, was extremely decisive during the conflict. I think we can already easily imagine how powerful of an impact at a psychological level, and even when it comes to troop morale, would have been for a medieval army, let's say if you were a medieval soldier, to have or to be told by your king and by the church and the ecclesiastical authorities that a young woman that is joining your army is chosen by God. She is in fact operating under a mandate, and not only that, but that she was blessed, and therefore so are you, and so is your entire cause, and that she had supernatural experiences and direct connections with God, with several saints, with Mary. Surely, from the perspective of a Christian army, that would have had an enormous impact. But regardless, as we examine Joan of Arc's full spectrum of contribution, then you will notice that we will be touching upon several areas, some of which might be unexpected. First and foremost, let's go deeper a little bit on this psychological impact of Joan's character. To begin with, more or less consciously, the figure of Joan exploited a series of different interconnected traditions, according to which it had been prophesied that salvation for France would come from a young girl. In reality, there were in fact more than one prophecy involved, some of which may have been a little vague. For example, Geoffrey of Monmouth, in the Life of Merlin, attributes to the wizard Merlin the prophecy that, open quotes, a marvelous maid will come from the Nemus Canutum for the healing of nations. Now, the name or the location called Nemus Canutum was interpreted to be a specific forest, the so-called Le Bois Chesnu, a forest that arose relatively close to the village of Domremy, where Joan was from. The prophecy reported by Geoffrey was overlaid with that of the mystic Marie of Avignon, who had predicted to Charles VI that an armed maiden would raise French fortunes. In any case, this was a folkloric baggage common to French popular traditions, and from this, Joan's figure could only draw great strength, in combination with the charisma and magnetic personality of the girl, which had managed to earn a meeting with the Dauphin of France, regardless of the fact that we're talking about a 16-year-old, illiterate peasant girl. As you read the sources and all of the historiographic mentions, one could say that there was a sort of strong enthusiasm and a certain level of exaltation radiating by Joan's figure, both in her deeds and her words. We are told that she would enforce a certain level of behavior from her soldiers, that she would be chasing prostitutes from French camps sword in hand, and that she would force her militia to attend religious services. She would tell them not to blaspheme, but above all to behave honestly and not overbearingly towards the civilian population during movements. Now, of course, a certain level of religious attendance, particularly from a character who was so religiously imbued, can be understood. I think it's important to spend a minute or two to just talk about this idea of during movement you've gotta behave, soldiers, because this is in fact something quite special in this specific context. Allow me to elaborate. You see, in a reality and in a historical context such as that of medieval warfare, it was almost normal for marching armies to sustain themselves by indiscriminately plundering the territories they crossed, and sometimes even those that they were technically called to defend. And such an attitude could definitely make a difference, especially in a context like the 100 Years' War, which, as we have explained earlier, rather than just being a conflict between France and England, so foreign powers, it was at this stage also a sort of civil war between the Burgundians and the Armagnacs. Therefore, the approach desired by Joan for the French army, and willingly accepted because it came from an extremely charismatic figure who responded to the concretization of a local tradition, led to the adherence to Charles VII's cause of a large portion of the French population, as well as the extemporaneous arming of numerous volunteers from the civilian population, who allowed to swell the ranks of the French army. Another thing that we will notice as we review particularly the reports when it comes to, for instance, the Siege of Orleans, is that Joan of Arc's charisma, strengthened by her mystic halo, led her troops and allowed her troops to manage certain leaps that we could say would be rather remarkable, which can only be justified by a deep and almost ecstatic exaltation of morale. Joan, on the other hand, if it's not clear how much she actually fought in person, rode or advanced fully armed and armored, wearing her white banner, wherever it was most necessary to spur on the men, so much so that she was wounded several times in battle between shoulder and a collarbone by an arrow at the Siege of Orleans. And even though you may be familiar with the arrow that penetrated her collarbone here, and they had to remove the armor, remove it surgically, put the armor back on, and put her back on the horse so that the soldiers wouldn't be demoralized and she was ready to join the fight again, I mean, that is impressive already. Have you ever heard of this one? According to the historical record, she was hit in the head by a stone hurled from the ramparts of Jagot that was thrown from the battlements, and the stone smashed her helmet, yet she survived. That's a good helmet. Like mine. She was also wounded in a thigh by a crossbow bolt during the siege of Paris. So even though we're not sure how trained she would have been, probably not that much, she did absolutely take part in all sorts of battles and sieges, and she led from the front. Also, another thing just to say, look how incredible medieval plate armor was at this time. I mean, she wasn't wearing armor, she would have been dead 3 times. What surprises most of all, however, is that in addition to being a representative and inspiring figure who led her soldiers, exalted their spirits and spurred them on, Joan also had real tactical skills as a leader. According to the testimony of the captain who fought at her side, Joan was a skilled strategist, open quote, except for matters of war, declared a captain of Chartres during the rehabilitation trial. She was simple and innocent, but in the guidance and organization of armies and in the conduct of war, in arranging an army for battle and in haranguing the soldiers, she behaved like the most experienced captain in the world, like someone with a lifetime of experience. This is reported by historian Régine Pernoud in the rehabilitation trial of Joan of Arc, page 108. The Duke of Alençon, who had fought directly on her side, this is an eyewitness, tells us, open quotes, in the conflict of war, she was very skilled, both in carrying the standard alone and in arranging the army in battle order, and in positioning the artillery, and all were astonished by the fact that she acted with such prudence and clarity of vision in military matters, with the competence of a great captain with 20 or 30 years of experience, and especially in the positioning of artillery, in which she behaved magnificently. Page 142. Now, considering the fact that these are the opinions of military men, people that actually had experience, direct experience on the field of war, and this is what they are telling us. The picture that is appearing now is not only of a very charismatic, in fact religiously charismatic person, but also someone who is a leader. So rather than imagining Joan of Arc as a warrior, I think in fact that's a little reductive. She wasn't a warrior, she was a leader of armies and a leader of men. Obviously, if she had to fight one-to-one against a trained English knight, yeah, my money's on the English knight, 100%. But this is not what characterizes Joan of Arc and the power of her influence. So, if on one hand, it may surprise that a young peasant girl showed military knowledge recognized by French nobles, on the other hand, perhaps it should not be excessively surprising. One of the main problems relating to the tactics of the French army during the 100 Years' War had been that of approaching the conflict in a not very dynamic way, respecting slow timings dictated by tradition, by the management of an incredibly complicated chain of command that reflected not so much military skill as the scale of nobility. Joan pushed, when possible, simply to attack the English forces quickly, without excessive delays, wherever they manifested themselves, particularly favouring extemporaneous assaults on marching columns and supply trains. Now, certainly this is not enough in order to justify her ability in deciding matters connecting to, for example, the positioning of the artillery, as we have been told by the Duke of Alençon, and the only thing we can really accept is that evidently the girl had a particularly logical and calculating mind, at least when it comes to the military and ballistic field. She was a natural. But how much, in an absolute framework relative to the 100 Years' War, was Joan's contribution decisive? It is undeniable that immediately after Joan's death, under the leadership of Duke of Bedford, England managed to recapture many of the losses suffered, but it is equally undeniable that it never again managed to find itself in a position of total advantage, like it did at the Siege of Orléans before Joan's arrival. Therefore, in conclusion, just over 20 years after Joan's death, France had practically annihilated its adversary, beyond the victories on the field, perhaps ephemeral and imaginative dreamlike myth that made her a warrior coming straight out of a prophecy. Joan's figure should be highly recognized for the fact that she showed how a certain reality, a certain future was possible. It is therefore her mind, her influence, her religious aura, and the heroine's actions that should be studied, rather than any modernistic take on her figure. And whether it be the Lancastrian English arms that were halted on the road to victory, whether it be the political occurrence that the King of France was given the prestige of coronation, Joan of Arc's intervention was decisive, and the page she wrote, contrary to all expectations in the history of France, deserves to be remembered as one of the finest. But this concludes our little discussion and excursus and a little bit of a video essay on Joan of Arc's influence. Please let me know what you think in the comments below, and as always, thank you so much for watching until the end. If you're not yet a member of this community, become a noble one, subscribe to my channel for more content from the Metatron, and remember, the Metatron has spread his wings.